Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning and welcome to the DGAP's morning briefing on geopolitical challenges. I'm Henning Hoff, Executive Editor of Internationale Politik Quarterly. This morning, we will once again discuss Russia's war against Ukraine, which President Vladimir Putin launched on February the 24th. 5 days ago, we passed the 7-month mark. Today, we are writing, if I'm counting correctly, day 220 of the invasion. As we briefly touched on last week, the war has entered a new phase. Putin ordered a partial mobilization of 300,000 reservists, renewed his nuclear threats, and announced that referenda, so-called, would take place in the occupied territories, which had previously been postponed. These sham referenda concluded 2 days ago with the predictable result of almost 200% of those taking part said that they wanted their regions to join Russia. The final decision of formally annexing Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk seems to be a couple of days after. The sham elections, or sham referenda, were widely condemned as illegal and immaterial. Even Kazakhstan said it would not recognize them. Partial mobilization in Russia, meanwhile, has caused remarkable instances of protest and resistance across the country. Men of military age are fleeing in great numbers, with long queues building at border checkpoints. The regime may soon be forced to close its borders. Also this week, leaks were discovered at both the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 gas pipelines. The latter has never become operational, though, with both experienced a drastic fall of pressure. While former Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski joked, or so we assume, on Twitter when writing "Thank you, USA," it is widely believed that this was an act of sabotage perpetrated by Russia, raising questions about the security of Europe's energy infrastructure. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen warned of, quote, most serious consequences, while the Kremlin, of course, showed itself also extremely concerned. To discuss all this and more, we have 3 experts with us this morning to discuss this situation again. In order of appearance, I have the pleasure of welcoming my DGAP colleague, Dr. Stefan Meister, who leads the International Order and Democracy Program here at the German Council on Foreign Relations. As you all know, he is one of Germany's leading experts on Russia. Good morning, Stefan.
Good morning.
And in an act of self-promotion, allow me to point you to Stefan's article, Elements of Containing Russia, which is part of the IPQ fall issue, which was published this morning. We will be posting a link in a minute. And it is also a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Elena Stein, who leads the Center for Independent Social Research in Berlin. CISR specializes in social research in post-Soviet countries, and Elena will share her views on the present situation in Russia. Welcome, Elena.
Thank you and good morning.
And last but not least, we'll be hearing from Wilfried Jilge, one of Germany's outstanding experts on Ukraine, who is an associate fellow of DGAP. His main role presently is Mediation Advisor Ukraine at the German Center for International Peace Operations, called CIF. He will share his insights into the situation in Russia-occupied areas in Ukraine. Good morning, Wilfried.
Good morning, hello.
Each speaker has about 6 to 7 minutes for their remarks. We will be opening up for your questions and comments after roughly 30 minutes. For the Q&A, please raise your hand to ask a question or submit a question via the chat function. Please note that this event will be recorded and that we will have to close on time at 9:30 a.m. At this point, I'd like to thank my colleague Milan Nitsch, the DGAP's expert for Central and Eastern Europe, who's been instrumental in organizing these morning briefings. And now, to start us off, let's turn to Stefan for his assessment.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Also happy to be again with you. I have only 6 to 7 minutes, so I decided to focus on the mobilization and what does it mean for Russia and Ukraine. We can also later discuss, if there is an interest, the Shanghai summit and the reactions also by other leaders, but also the blows around Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. I think that's also an important issue. So I'm happy also to give my assessment on this, but I really want to focus because of the limited time. So with the decision for a partly mobilization on September the 21st, I would say Putin made a fundamental shift against de-escalation towards further escalation in his war against Ukraine. With this mobilization, Putin is planning for a longer war in which he now drags Russian society. So I think that's a major shift also in Russian politics, with major impact on domestic situation in Russia, as we already have seen also with the huge amount of people who try to leave the country, but also the way they try to mobilize people who are not interested in being dragged into this war. At the same time, with the sham referenda and the annexation of the occupied territories, the war in Ukraine is becoming a war about Russian territory. I think that's also a major shift in terms of how Russia will deal with these territories and how it will consolidate these territories and try to deter also Ukraine and the West, that Ukraine gets the ability to take them back. With this decision, Putin links his own political and personal future with a victory in eastern Ukraine. Will the Russian army, despite the mobilization, not win additional territories? The regime will get under more pressure. Also, in the elite, the key actors in the elite will ask if Putin is still the right person to lead Russia. Therefore, the partly mobilization has given Ukraine and the West an instrument into hands to put the regime further under pressure. So I think it's really a wrong decision of Putin, because he narrows his opportunities now. If there's no victory, I think his prestige as the strong man, as the strong leader, I think is becoming more, is just not working anymore. For Putin, there's no alternative than winning the war, and he missed the opportunity in early summer to go into ceasefire negotiations when his army was still winning territories in eastern and southern Ukraine. In short term, this partly mobilization will not make a big difference. There's a lack of military instructors. They are all in Ukraine, equipment, and it will take 3 to 4 months to bring these people into relevant fighting conditions. Will the Russian leadership send these people too early to the front? They will rather become cannon fodder. That will raise even more negative reactions in the Russian society. Independent Russian media argue that Russian leadership wants to mobilize not 300,000, but up to 1.2 million soldiers until November the 10th. So a much bigger amount, which means a hidden full mobilization, you could argue. But I think it's rather unlikely that it's possible to mobilize even 300,000 people under force as they do it now. So I'm really curious about how they want to do this and how they want to reach the numbers, the real numbers maybe they have planned. At the same time, the partly mobilization will not eliminate the structural deficits of the Russian army. While this mobilization will generate new troops and is a decision in favor of a protracted war, the social and economic costs for Russia will only grow. At some point, I would argue the leadership will have to switch to a fully war economy, which will raise the economic and the social costs again. These new troops will hardly play a role for the Russian army this year and will only be relevant after the winter. So I think that's then the most important time. It seems that Putin is willing to accept greater casualties on the Russian side with poorly trained soldiers, while the defense minister cannot solve the Russian army's logistical and equipment problems. With the sham referendum in the occupied territories and their annexation by Russia, the Kremlin wants to secure the territories and deter further action by the Ukrainian army. Russia can mobilize more people in these territories, and it is easier to deploy also troops there. At the same time, the Kremlin can threaten with nuclear weapons because they are now, according to the Russian leadership, part of Russia. If that will deter Russia to further Ukraine, it will deter Ukraine to further attack Russia, the territories, I think is questionable. And that means further escalation. With the partly mobilization, Putin made a fatal decision for Russian domestic policy. Now the war has arrived in the Russian society, which is highly unpopular. Putin will antagonize his core electorate of up to 70% of the Russians, which were always passive and supported the regime. He further destroys the social contract. There's now neither welfare for political inactivity nor personal safety anymore for the Russian society. So I do not think that we will see mass mobilization. For this, the state is too repressive and larger parts of the society too passive. But we will see destructive actions of the society and shrinking support of Mr. Putin. With the aggressive mobilization in ethnic republics, in particular in ethnic republics, the leadership might also fuel ethnic conflicts in the society in future. And after the defeat in Kharkiv, Putin has been criticized domestically by different camps. So there were the nationalists and the ultra-patriots who argued for full mobilization, shift to a war. And we had these liberal local deputies criticizing Putin's policy and also demanding his removal. I think the effects of this criticism are limited, but I think that the people are willing to take the risk after the pressure from the security forces in the last month show how much the regime is also internally under pressure. Therefore, I think the mobilization is a kind of a clearance kick domestically and internationally to show strength and keep the escalation dominance in Russia. At the same time, the more Putin comes under pressure, the greater the risk of an escalation involving tactical nuclear or chemical weapons. I think NATO's nuclear deterrence works, so I don't see here really a high risk. But if the Russian army cannot deliver in Ukraine, if Kiev recaptures areas in Donbass or would even attack Crimea, it cannot be ruled out that Putin will attack with nuclear weapons. It's certainly true that with such a step, he would further isolate himself internationally. And I can also imagine that China and India will not tolerate it either. But Putin has already crossed so many red lines that I think the risk is there. We cannot ignore this risk. For this reason, I think it would be wrong not to supply Ukraine with any or only certain weapons, because it would not stop Putin. But it should be made clear to Moscow what the consequences of a nuclear escalation on the territory of Ukraine would mean. So I think it needs really a kind of a deterrent strategy, but it cannot be the conclusion not to supply Ukraine with weapons. Yeah, I think that would be the wrong conclusion. It would also not stop Putin. So my last point, the most likely scenario for a change of power does not come from the society with the mass demonstrations or with from liberal actors or oligarchs. I think we have discussed this already several times, but from the security elites and Putin's immediate environment. If Putin cannot longer deliver in terms of power politics, populism, and resources, he will be replaced by another actor trying to preserve the Putin system. It is all the more important, in addition to further arms deliveries to Ukraine, to stick to the economic sanctions, which are now taking effects more and more, and to keep offers to Russian elites and society for the change of policy. So I'm not an advocate for isolating Russia completely. I have said this already several times. I'm also criticizing complete visa bans towards Russia because I think that will rather play into the hands of the security elites. So it will only strengthen hardliners, and some kind of offer and openness by the West would signal that there are ways out of the situation under certain conditions, and I think without Putin. Yeah, and I think that should be a signal to the elites and also to the society without isolating Russia completely. So I stop here at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Lots of stuff to unpick, but maybe one quick question about sort of the decision Putin has taken. Someone sort of summed it up as sort of "let me win or I nuke you," which is probably a little sort of over the top. But do you think Putin has done that because he thinks he can really win that way, or is it just to create sort of more sort of elements of a future negotiation where you can sort of trade, I don't know, one annexation for some other concession, or how do you see this?
So you mean the referenda, or what do you mean?
Well, the mobilization and going for the referenda, is that sort of, does he really think he can win that way?
No, I think I tried to explain that he haven't seen any alternative. He for him, ceasefire negotiations at this point, when he's losing, when he's weak, is not an option. So I think he did not, and we had this pressure from inside of Russia also. So there people are unhappy also in the elites. In the supporter of him are also unhappy. So I think he had not seen any alternative to this decision to do at least a party mobilization, even if he knows that this is highly unpopular in the society. So he's taking a risk here, but he's taking a risk because he needs to show strength. He needs to win the territories back before he can go into any kind of negotiations. At the same time, I think for me this is a decision for a longer war. So he prepares for a longer war. You don't mobilize society just to do ceasefire negotiations. So I think that this war about Ukraine, this war about southern part of Ukraine, the whole Ukraine has not ended. I think it's not just accepting now Donbass or Eastern Ukraine. We had again also in his speech mentioning Novaya Russia, as a concept. So I think he has not given up his main goal of taking Ukraine and bringing Ukraine under control. And I think that's the problem. Yeah, even if he's losing at the moment, he's just going further, in terms of what he can mobilize, and that limits his opportunities also, in terms of negotiations. But he has less options now also, and that makes him also so dangerous, because in the end he will run out. And I think on the referendum, it's also about, and Wilfried might also say something about this later. But I think it's on one hand about securing these regions, then also nuclear signaling, I think can be an option. Mobilizing also people there for the war against Ukraine, and then give all this illegal, even if we all know this is fake, but for him it was always important that this has a kind of a legal framework, so, and that's why he's at least doing these kind of whatever you want to call it. These are not referenda, I think this is forced people just to sign something, so, and I think even if it's just disgusting, but I think still he sticks to this legal framework. I think that's also for him important.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Now let's move on to Elena for her assessment of the situation in Russia.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much. I'm a sociologist. I was asked just to give an overview about the current mood in Russia concerning to party mobilization. So let me start. Yes. So let me go back a little to the first months when Russia started the war in Ukraine. In the beginning, we could identify 4 categories of citizens in Russia. Those who opposed the policies of the Russian state and the war in Ukraine, some persons who actually supported it, a group of undecided citizens with a strong "not everything is so clear-cut" thesis, and the group of indifferent persons who, until the movement of mobilization, did not really get involved in the geopolitical affairs of the country because they believe that their opinion does not really affect anything, and therefore the whole issue doesn't particularly concern them. And what does this mean for the exit of persons from Russia? There have been many studies already on the first wave of migration. One of the main conclusions is that migration from March to June concerns the politically active part of the population. People who decided to leave in the first months after February 25th were open about their civic attitudes also before the war. For many of them, moving to another country was largely linked to the possibility of continuing doing or to fight the regime outside Russia. I will not idealize the so-called first wave today, but I note, for example, that the gender composition of those who emigrate was relatively balanced at that moment, as well as examples of their adaptation integration in the countries of relocation. So, for example, only in Berlin alone, more than 100 anti-war initiatives were created in the last 6 months. The partial mobilization announced on 21st of September suddenly and massively changed this already familiar logic. Too little time actually passed since the beginning of the mobilization to be able to give an in-depth sociological analysis of what is happening. There are no studies on this changing of migration yet. I can only rely on press reports and journalistic opinions, also analyzing of social networks and conversation with those who have fled and those who still are in Russia. What can we say at the moment? What are people in today's Russia thinking and feeling, and what does this mean for their willingness to leave the country? I would say the mood of people is generally threefold at the moment. The first and most obvious feeling is fear and panic. Fear for your life. If this is a reason to move, everything is more or less clear. European borders are practically closed, as we know already. Hence, people look for other routes to exit Russia, countries such as Kazakhstan, but also Georgia and Armenia, Uzbekistan and Turkey still accept Russian refugees, and sometimes new destinations show up, such as Mongolia at the moment. The second group of people who are in their mood and who is visible in public discourse, this is those who are ready to accept the fact of mobilization and are prepared in case of conscription to go to war. Their motives are rather diverse, but it doesn't matter because nothing changed in their opinions in that. And then there is a third group of people who started blaming the mobilization primarily not on Putin, as might seem obvious at first, but on the Ukrainians. So we've heard a lot of voices and their rationale, all the troubles and risk of their own death originate in Kiev. So that don't blame Putin, as we would love to think and hope for Russian citizens, but they still blame Ukrainians and NATO and USA, of course. And here it can be noted that even in one group, strategies can be diametrically different, because the role of fear is enormous. It concerns actually all groups. And what happens to the people that stay in Russia? Do they go out on the street? I would say for a while there was a notion that it was still possible to protest in Russia in some way. Today there are only very few exceptions in which this is still possible. The protest movement has practically been killed by the repressive machine. If 6 months ago you could get away with an administrative fine for protesting, today being caught on the streets leads to imprisonment or extremely high fines. I would mention, just let you know that in the last year, the amount of fine, like of penalty that people have to pay, increased in 10 times. But a new kind of protest is emerging since the mobilization. One that could already be observed during the First and Second Chechen War, and I'm talking about movement of Soldash-Maza. But today we see the examples of Dagestan or Yakutia, which are very telling, especially when you consider that the average Russian didn't expect it from those regions. And in this context, it was very interesting to read the interpretations of the protests in Dagestan and Ukrainian and Russian sources. Like Ukrainian media sources told us the police shot in the air and the SARS forced the woman to disperse. And the Russian media told a different story, commented, the police explained the situation to the woman, after which they went home. So you see how the image of these protests are developing in the public media differently. But why do I mention this protest? I think that this form of protest, or even active defense of the children, could play a key role in the future, or it's probably only my hope. But I think this is a very different situations compared with the first 6 months of war. So let me be more short, because I already used my time, I think. I would, yes, at the start of the war, exactly, and why I also think that these women protests are very important for Russia at the moment, because it's not only women protests, it's a protest that affects everyone else too, neighbors and relatives. Even those who originally supported the war, they begin to feel differently about it, because the war is now affecting them personally. And this is very important change in Russia. And at the start of the war, these people didn't care. And we can compare to the Chechen or Afghan war. The military was going somewhere, but this did not concern them. And most even wanted our motherland to win, because it wasn't them waging the war, not their friends or children. But on September 21st, everything changed. It suddenly turned out that I had to get off the couch, stop being a fan, or not being interested at all. I can imagine this today. More and more Russians know the geography of Ukraine better than Russians. But if you exclude the fear, what will actually happen towards the authorities? It is less about what people think and how they feel about it. It's important to understand, will they do something? Unfortunately, I'm very pessimistic on this point. Most likely they will stay quiet, I guess, for the next months or year. We can assume that some protests, including women's protests, will continue, and most Russians will, in their minds, oppose mobilization. They may blame Putin personally or the Ukraine fascists. It doesn't matter, but this is not important in this context. Either way, they will most likely sit back and keep quiet. If you want to change something, it's always important to have some loud critical mass, at least 5 to 7% of the population who are ready to speak out. And this is where revolutions and change come from, not the fact that 90% for or against something. And in sociological terms, there is not one-to-one relationship between other thinking or attitudes and behaviors. So now we're observing like changing in other thinking, but still there is no changing in the behavior, in my opinion. And yeah, I would finish now with not an optimistic joke, but let me finish with an Soviet joke. What should you do when a nuclear war breaks out? Or I will cover myself with a sheet and crawl slowly into the cemetery. Why slowly? Oh, so as not to create a panic. So I think it's kind of very typical for the situation in Russia at the moment. Thank you very much, and sorry for bad internet.
No problem. I think thank you very much. I think you got your points across very well, and indeed, it's a as you say, in a society which is sort of ruled by fear, it's very difficult to sort of express any opinions. I think the same Same we have seen in the occupied territories of Ukraine, where about which Wilfried will now sort of give his assessment, and then we can soon start into the Q&A. Wilfried, please.
Okay, thank you, Henning. I would like to begin with the fact that we should be aware that the process with the so-called referenda or sham referenda, I even do not want to use the word referenda, have to be expected. According, for example, to one documents of the occupation forces I have now, it is a program for Kherson called Ruski Kherson. It was very clear that the occupation forces already in July and August intensively prepared the so-called referenda and the annexation process. The fact that the referenda happened now is a desperate reaction of Putin to the military situation on the ground. Otherwise, I think they would have shifted a little bit. Please let me also tell you that the document I mentioned is a clear expression of colonial rule. It is a document which tries to establish, actually in the southern regions, the so-called conception of Novorossiya or New Russia, and redefines the Ukrainians in the regions as Russians. To begin with the referenda, the sham referendums in the Russian-occupied regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia and Kherson were simply a farce. In contrast to the illegal referendums in Crimea in March 2014 and Donbass in May 2014, this time the de facto authorities in Donbass and the occupation forces in the southern regions not even try to give the theater of the absurd a semblance of legitimacy. The term referendum should not be used. In fact, it was a hastily organized special operation or political acclamation to legitimize colonial rule using coercion and violence. In the Donbass alone, the Eastern Human Rights Group counted 130 criminal cases imposed on people who refused to take part in the action or voted against the Anschluss. For the first few days, elections were conducted by mobile groups accompanied by armed military men who went from house to house or apartment to apartment to collect the needed votes at gunpoint, votes which were already decided before the election process. Electoral commissions were set up primarily in crowded urban centers in order to create a corresponding image of large crowds for the propaganda. But even here, we could identify the same persons voting on different places. Overall, the Russian Federation violated all provisions of international law and Ukrainian national legislation, including the Geneva Convention, which requires from occupation forces at maximum to respect the rights of the inhabitants of the occupied territories. Already, if you look at the voter ballots, it is very interesting. The voter ballots asking as following: do you support the exit of the region, so for example, Kherson or Zaporizhia, from Ukraine, the creation of an independent region, Kherson or Zaporizhia, and then the entry into Russian Federation. So we have three questions merged in one, and someone should ask, whenever could exist these independent unities created from the regions? What is also very important, if you look at the results in Kherson, 87%, Zaporizhia 93%, and in the Donbass until almost 100%. It should be noted that these results were already predicted before the election process by the deputy head of administration of Russian President Mr. Sergei Kirienko, who is a curator of that regions, as well as of representative of occupation forces. If you look at the figures, there are many contradictions. I only want to mention one. If we had in 2014 in Donetsk region 1.4 million voters registered officially, then it is very surprising that the occupation forces declared that 1.1 million voters took part in these so-called referenda, because when we take into account the forced evacuation before the start of the war, the mass deportation of people, the refugees, the forced mobilization, simply the figure of 1.1 million voters is absolutely not thinkable. What I also want to discuss here shortly is the future of these territories. So what we hear at the moment are speculations that the Russian Federation will create, for example, one big federal district, so consisting of all these newly occupied territories. However, I think that is not very realistic, because we have already now a big fight between different influence groups in the region. So that are influence groups, power groups from the Russian Federation, that is the Secret Service, that is the people of Kirienko, of the administration of the president. And we have sharp competition between the groups in the regions. That is to say, at first, the group around the head of the so-called autonomous Republic of Crimea, Mr. Aksyonov, and his people he installed already in the occupation territories in the south, on the one hand, and for example, a very important person, which was the head of Roscosmos recently, Mr. Dmitry Rogozin, one of the first propagators of the idea of Russian world, is still in the 90s. Rogozin is to be said to have maybe some function as a vice premier minister or as a head of a new federal district. What I think is more realistic, that there will be maybe two districts with the Donbas regions merged, for example, with the Rostov Oblast, and on the other hand, the southern regions merged maybe with Crimea. But what we will see in future, I think, and that will also affect on the efficiency on the new administrations, are still heavy conflicts of interest between all these local and national influential groups. And what the people in the regions will face, they will face that key positions of the annexed territories in the administration of the annexed territories will be filled by semi-criminal and oligarchic structures who try to continue their rent-seeking after they have exhausted other regions, like, for example, Crimea. Henning, in the end, I would like also to shortly focus what is going on in that regions, regardless of the election process. And here I would like to focus on the repressions. During the elections, the repressions characteristic of the occupation policy of Russia continued. It is about repressions regardless of the electoral process. Kidnapping by Russian military or pro-Russian proxies is a fundamental feature of Russian colonial rule. In Kherson alone, in the last 4 days, 4 people, including teachers, doctors, and representatives of the self-governments, have been kidnapped or disappeared without any information recently. The occupation authorities also continue to carry out brutal filtration measures organized to identify unreliable Ukrainian or pro-Ukrainian citizens or activists, former law enforcement officers, participants of the RTO, Ukrainian army servicemen, and to identify ammunition and military equipment. It is established that during September 2022, Russian militants carried out inspections of residential and non-residential premises in all temporarily occupied settlements of the Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblast, recorded the passport data and those residents who live near military facilities, and threatened them for attempting to conduct a fire lookout. Also, during inspections, special attention is paid to checking phones, computer equipment, and tracking of communication between local residents and organs in the controlled territories of Ukraine. We have also plundering. Militants of the Russian Federation are engaged in active looting. They break into private houses, garages, buildings of state institutions from which they steal valuables or damage property. Moreover, the arbitrary move to private houses and apartments of local residents who have been evacuated to the territory controlled by the Ukrainian authorities. Moreover, what we see now is a big pressure in education system actually in the southern regions. For example, parents are threatened to be deprived of their parents' rights if they continue or if they allow their children to continue distant instruction online, or simply to refuse to join the new schools or the new Russian instruction in the occupied territories. What I want to say in the end is that what I think should be done now is, of course, to continue the support of Ukraine by the West, but to embed that support with international diplomacy. The West actually should continue the process in the Security Council of the United Nations in order to clearly show what these referendums were about. They are about a full destruction of all international rules of the UN Charter we have. And the sham referenda should be an opportunity actually to communicate more intensively to China in order to make clear that if these practices continue, then even those rights and rules in the UN Charter are under pressure and are threatened, where non-Western states or even rival states to the West, like China, or states in between, like India, should have an interest in. So what we should do is, like Stefan also implied, we should, on the one hand, very calm and cool, continue the support of Ukraine, not to take the narrative of Putin and that escalation trap. But on the other hand, we should embed that in diplomacy in order to de-escalate that narrative and this process, as well as, and here I also would join Stefan, we should, of course, offer Russia that there can be in future negotiations about ceasefire, that there can be an exit, but of course under conditions, under the conditions that they have to give back the territory and to re-establish the integrity of Ukraine. Of course, Putin will not go for that, but what I have in mind is a signal to the whole leadership and elites of Russia in the moment when we see the first, as for example, Elena Stein said, when we see the first problems within Russia. So what we need is patience and I think also a consequent stand for international rules and law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wilfried. Only 50 minutes left now, I'm afraid. I'm sorry that we have overrun quite a bit. If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand now, and I'm happy to put your question to the panelists. Meanwhile, I mean, there's already one. Let's go to Mr. or Mrs. I can't see you, so please, yes. Please briefly introduce yourself and put your question, please.
Yes, good morning to everybody. My name is Alvydas Medalinskas. I'm from Lithuania, political analyst, who is currently now in Odessa, and I have also connections to the people, some in the occupied territories. So first of all, it's a pleasure to see Stefan and Wilfried and other colleagues here. And following what Wilfried was saying, I would say really following this so-called sham referendums, probably, sorry?
We can hear you, fine, please continue.
Oh, okay, sorry. So following that, many repressions will follow. So therefore, what Western community have to follow, it's all repression not against the political activists, but against the ordinary people who did not participate in such shame referendums. Secondly, to my understanding, it's very much important to show the support for Ukraine. And here's my one question. I think one of the best, let's say, symbols of the German support for Ukraine would be the IRIS system. Do you expect that the German government might provide IRIS system, anti-rocket system, to Ukraine within those days or within months or whatever, to show the support for Ukraine, that you do not believe that this really referendums matter and really this annexation of the territories? And second thing, what was discussed about Russia, why do you think Rogozin is regarded as a person who might take control and to organize all those repressions in the newly occupied territories? Why Kirienko is a little bit pushed out? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Both very and important questions. The second one, of course, refers to the head of the Wagner group, who has sort of been quite active in promoting himself as a military leader, and also for the first time after denying and taking people to court, who said that he would run Wagner, now sort of has admitted that he actually does run Wagner. Stefan, maybe on the weapons questions, that has been sort of downplayed in the last 2 weeks. But still the question is there, will Germany send more heavy weapons, especially tanks, Leopards, and what about Mr. Rogozin?
I think Wilfried can also say something on this. I think he has also an overview. So I think, yes, I think on one point there will be also this air defense system. The US is also discussing to send an air defense system. It will not be sufficient, for Ukraine. I think that's the problem. It's a huge country, and if you send 1 or 2 of them, or 2 or 3, I think that's already great, and it's something, but that's not enough. And I think that's also the question for me in terms of long-term weapon supply. So I think I have the impression we are still very much in reacting what comes next. I think the US has a longer term planning, definitely, but is also very careful in what they are supplying. There was this question also in the chat I wanted to react. Are we not dragging into this war? Are we not now, is this not very dangerous, in which situation we are? My impression is that the US is very careful at the moment to not supply certain kind of weapons, and that's why also Germany is not supplying, for instance, tanks, or some specific tanks, because there is no interest to further escalate, but also we cannot step back. I think it's just not an option not to supply Ukraine anymore. So I think at the moment the calculation is to give Ukraine enough that they can protect themselves and maybe even take a little bit more territories, but give them not enough to have a full scale or a larger scale, let's call it like this, offensive on the occupied territories. So, and I think that's a kind of a de-escalation or not escalation mechanism, and I don't see any alternative. I just want to underline Wilfried's point. I think we need more diplomatic initiatives. We need also more blaming Russia for what it is doing in international institutions, and I think that's the strength of German politics. So where is Germany here? Also, yeah, and I think it also the UN needs to be used more. We need more communication with China, India, with other countries who made very clear at the Shanghai Organization Summit, including also Erdogan, that they are not supporting this war, how it is going now. And Erdogan made this point: if you give the territories back, we can talk about a future relationship with Russia, I think. And I think that's the offer, maybe not to Putin, but to the environment of Putin. I think that is very important, and there needs more action. And why Rogozin? So I think Kirienko was not so efficient in organizing what Putin wanted, what the Kremlin, what Putin wanted. I think it's a very tricky situation there, but he was not supplying what he should supply. Yeah, so maybe it was not possible. So let's try Rogozin. Yeah, I think he's ideological, the right guy. He's really I think how to say it. From also in terms of how he was dealing with the West in the NATO, and how he's dealing also with the ultra patriots, the nationalists. I think we should not underestimate this. I think Putin is criticized that he's not doing enough by the nationalists and ultra patriots at home. Rogozin is someone who can talk with these people. He has the same language. So I think if he's now managing this, I think that helps maybe also Putin. And let's try another guy, yeah, also in doing this dirty job. And if he fails, they will find someone else.
Thank you very much. Wilfried, do you want to come in shortly? And then
yes, only shortly. First, it was a big mistake from parts of the West and also from Germany to open up a discussion on tanks, on old Leopard tanks from the 90s, which only should compensate and replace modernized T-72 tanks, which the Ukrainians got from old Soviet storages. So what I have in mind is we gave Putin before the referenda already an opportunity to define, based on our statements, what is escalation and what not. And that is a big, big mistake. You never should do that, because Putin nevertheless, and the referenda showed that he himself is defining where are the lines of escalation and not. That is the first point. Second point, Rogozin is one of the founders, the young Rogozin, who founded the party Rodina in the 90s, together with Lushkov. Maybe someone remembers that name, mayor of Moscow. They founded these ideas of Russian world, of compatriot policy, of Novorossiya. So he has, let me say, also the ideology, professional competency to do that.
Thank you very much. There's one question in the chat by Delphine Nebolier from La Croix newspaper, which maybe is one for Elena to answer. Do we have any information how Russians in Germany are sort of feeling about this latest step, and Russian Germans? Don't know, Elena, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, the question was how supportive. Yeah, quite supportive. So we're like my colleagues from another organizations and also from anti-war initiatives are dealing like don't sleep since last week at all, because we are trying to organize the routes for special difficult issues, like to relocate young men from Russia over their borders. Unfortunately, not to Germany, because at the moment we only have two possibilities which really work. They are like humanitarian visa, but only possible to apply within the lists, which we can make here, but still it takes a lot of time. And the second possibility is a freelance visa, and it also takes a time. So we work a lot, but we organize the routes to other countries, mostly to Kazakhstan and Georgia. Yeah, but there is I don't know, there's a very supportive community at the moment in Berlin about this.
Thank you very much. I think there are two more questions by Gesine Denker and Boris Ginsburg. Let maybe take them in a row. Ms. Denker, please.
Okay, this is Gesine Denker from the Japanese newspaper Yomiuri Shimbun. I would like to bring up to the table the Nord Stream 1 and 2 attacks. We haven't talked about it yet, but Stefan, Meister, could you tell us what could be the benefit by Russia, if it should be by Russia? What is the benefit for them, or what could be the benefit?
Thank you very much. And Boris Ginsburg, please.
Yeah, hello. Two short questions to the panelists. The first one, I would like to know, what is your opinion about the fact that Poland and the Baltic states are not ready to take Russian deserters into their country? And the second question is in regard to Belarus. Yesterday, Lukashenko visited Abkhazia, and I would like to know how do you assess this event against the background of the referenda, so-called referenda in Ukraine? Because if I remember right, in 2007, 2008, most of the sanctions were lifted against Belarus just because Lukashenko was not ready to recognize such territories as Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and so on. So I would like to know your opinion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think Stefan in the first place.
Oh, Nord Stream 2, sorry, 1 and 2. So I think we all just one thought. I think we all understand that there are very few actors who can do this kind of blow. Yeah, so I think you need the equipment, you need to go to dig deep, you need to be also somehow present there. So I think there are very few options who would be able to do such a blow. Yeah, so and I think that makes it very likely. Let's formulate it very cautiously, that there are Russian actors behind this. And what would be their interest? The gas price is decreasing at the moment. Yeah, we see that you still can hear me, oh, because I have some yeah, okay. My laptop is doing something at this moment, very interesting. So I think the gas price was decreasing, and also the oil price was decreasing. I think not that we are on a normalization, but there was a kind of relaxation on the global market. And I think now Germany has purchased more gas, yeah, and so on. So I think this is about psychology. If you blow in this moment pipelines, even if they are not used, yeah, I think they are not on the market, you will increase the price. You will put pressure on the market, and you will put pressure on Germany and the other European countries who are now ahead of the winter and have a hot discussion about what does it mean also in terms of social of social situation, mobilization of the society, and so on. And I think that is the main use. I think Russia cannot use these pipelines anymore. They are rubbish now in a way. So the only way to use them is to manipulate the price and the market. And I think this is exactly taking place. The price is growing because of the psychological effects. Yeah. So and I think that would be the main interest on Poland, the Baltic states. So I understand the Polish and the Baltic colleagues that they have security concerns. So I don't want to play this down. Yeah, it's a huge number of people. I was just recently in Armenia and Yerevan and also in Tbilisi. The huge amount of Russians, they just overstretch these countries and societies. It's a security risk in a way. It will fuel also tensions, and it overstretches the infrastructure also of these countries. And looking into the Baltic states, who are the main border, I really understand this kind of security concerns. On the other hand, I think I cannot. So I think it's also about us. Why we don't have more visa for these people. We're talking about humanitarian visa, which are very few. And I think that's not enough. Most of the opposition people, most of the critical people, NGO people, they traveled out with tourist visa, which have been limited. Yeah. So, and I think that's a problem. It puts these small countries also under pressure and they react, yeah, in a way. And I think we need an EU policy also for this, which is not a policy of closing everything, but finding a way also for, you have to scan the people, to check the people. I understand all this, but also giving visa. And I think that would be for me the right policy also to support these countries. And maybe one sentence on Belarus, on Lukashenko in Abkhazia. So I think we now also understand that Lukashenko is anyway, so he's in the hands of Putin, of Russia. I think he has no leverage anymore to do anything. I think for me that might be a sign also about further annexations of Russia. I think we had the discussion in Armenia also about pressuring Armenia into the union state. So I think there might be more policy coming up of annexing South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and maybe even pushing other post-Soviet countries into the union state beside Belarus. So I see here really a threat and no red lines anymore. And I don't know what role Lukashenko is playing for Putin, yeah, but I think he has not many other countries or pseudo countries to travel anymore. So then let's go to Abkhazia and send also signals here to Moscow, yeah, in this sense.
Thank you very much. I think we answered all the questions that have been coming up, and we are sort of out of time. So I think if Elena or Wilfried don't have a sort of urge to come up with a sort of final word, my sort of general feeling is sort of, do we see a certain point, or is it conceivable that Russia will regain the initiative which it had lost on the battlefield? I think that is one of the big questions which sort of are connected with this sort of recent events. But if that's not the case, I think then I would like to thank our panelists, thank you all for joining us this morning again, and looking forward to seeing you all again next Thursday. A very good morning to all.